18th Legion, the flame-wreathed sons of Nocturne, born beneath a sky of ash, raised among the obsidian cliffs of a dying world, masters of fire and walking volcanic vengeance in power armor. They are also the only all-round good guys of the Astartes, and now also poster boys for the new edition of Horus Heresy and the Saturn 9 release box. Shout out to Games Workshop, thanks for dropping everything in the box. These Mark II suits included solo right after the Saturn 9 performed about as good as a Ferrous Manos headbutt. Really makes a guy feel like he made a financial wise decision 2 weeks ago. But the problem is, ever since I saw the Mark II suits, I knew I wanted to paint them, and I couldn't wait, because I just enjoy yet another take on the Space Marines armor design. I'm serious. What I particularly like about the Mark II design is the sleeker and lighter pattern, and especially the segmented leg armor. The added grooves on the shins break up the otherwise large surface, and the additional elements on the upper leg just breaks the monotony of a single armor color and offers some customization options. However, the Mark II suits are released as very generic sculpts, obviously so they can fit a lot of different legions, but the Salamanders are quite boisterous, led by Vulcan himself, a Primarch who wrapped himself in artifacts of war that could humble even a Warlord Titan. And his followers too are usually draped in Drakehide and bearing symbols that represent the forges of their homeworld. However, they are also criminally underrepresented when it comes to upgrade sprues. So I already was making plans for some major conversions, basically which Age of Sigmar parts I could source, digging through Stormcasts and Soros Warrior sprues like a tech priest rummaging through STCs. But then I found out that Greytide Studios just put out their annual Warden set, which really is a great fit for the theme. I've been using their bits a lot in the past. They have a giant range, and that helped me when I redesigned my Sanguinary Guard, and were a godsend when I built my Deathwing Terminators into the walking cathedrals they're supposed to be. I highly suggest you check them out if you are into customizing your minis. The Annual Warden set in particular offers over 150 parts, and that's not just customization, that's practically temptation. You can already hear these guys whispering.
Forge me, brother.
So I printed almost all of the set and a couple of duplicates on my Haygears Ultracraft Reflex RS Turbo. Try saying that 5 times fast without summoning a warp entity. So I would have all the potential options in front of me while building my Mark II Marines. I was particularly intrigued by the cloaks, and I also like the Drakehide loincloths. There's also tons of weapon options and a lot of great helmets and head variants. And of course, all these awesome shoulder guards. These Annual Warden bits are properly sized for Primaris Marines though, and since the Mark II Marines are smaller, I had to do some fiddling before I could print the final bits for this project. Once I had a few good scale references though, that wasn't a big deal. First I picked up a Primaris Marine shoulder guard and held it next to the Mark II pauldrons. I measured the inside where they would make contact with the arms. I measured 2/3 of a millimeter, which in Forge World terms is roughly just add more glue, but in reality that translated to scaling them down by about 8%, and that worked out really nicely. The pauldrons fit the arms perfectly, and they also looked very in scale. These Heroic Poses bits offered some great opportunities to create really unique minis. Hammers are the perfect close combat arms to choose, because to Salamander, a hammer is not just a weapon, it's a symbol of duty. The same hand that tempers steel must also bring righteous ruin to the enemies of mankind. When you're the nicest guy at the war crime, you bring a weapon that says, I could have built something with this, but instead I decided to use it to turn you into floor paste. I shrunk these down by 10% because remember, I printed one set in full size and compared it to a Mark II arm, and it was a little shorter. So 10% smaller looked more accurate. I continued to add some backpacks, cloaks and weapon options to my build plate and fiddled around a bit, basically shrinking them down to fit, but I also mirrored the hammers, for example, so I could try and see which one looked better. I also added some shields because I wanted to see how these bits would work with the Assault Marines that are not out yet, but I really want to build some when they release. If nothing else, then for their giant oversized jetpacks. I also added some additional details like loincloths, iconography and basing material. The pack also comes with some themed base toppers, which are always a nice bonus if you don't want to think about custom basing. And once I had everything I needed printed, I assembled the legs and torso of a few different Marines, and I gotta say the cleanup was very minimal in these kits. Just some very small and delicate mold lines. Cleaning each marine and assembling it to the stage took like 2 minutes. Really a breath of fresh air after assembling a Z09 Terminator the day before. I was pretty set on giving most of them a loincloth of some sort, because nothing says tactical readiness like your private parts being protected by impenetrable Drakehide. Wait. Of course that's the first search result. Hell yeah! So, anyway, I slapped one of the cloaks on that one pose that looked really cool when the B-keys first came out, but oh my god, this cape has been made for this pose. If you told me Greytide sculpted it with that one marine in mind, I'd believe you. I added the hammer and now it looks like he's casually carrying it while he's popping heretics left and right with his gun. Heretic smashing casual. I added a helmet with some kind of scales running across, and I also added that fire effect that came with the Animal Wardens pack. I'd later do a fire effect on this that I think turned out really great. I also popped the shoulder guard on that I liked, and this one was ready to go. Next I built an Assault Marine at ease with an old Chaos Raptor jump pack, because why wait for Games Workshop to release new kits when you can just loot the traders? And I think the second hammer works really great for this particular pose. It literally worked perfectly at 10% scale reduction. Once the assault squad comes out, this one is going right into mine as an honorable veteran. I also built one dude with a disintegrator and no helmet because I want to experiment with salamander skin tones. And another one with one of the fancier backpacks, basically turning him into a walking OSHA violation. Fire hazards everywhere. And I'm looking forward to play with some OSL and reflections on this one. These bits look fantastic and really bring these guys to life. If you agree and want to get some of them for your own army, I'm happy to share a 20% discount that Greytide Studio kindly provided to viewers of my channel. And the good news is, it works on all of their digital assets. Just go to my mini factory or Cards 3D through the links in the description and enter my discount code. The promotion is only running until the 28th of August though, so pick them up right away if you don't want to miss out on the offer. Physical copies are also available from Only Games if you're more into sniffing glue than inhaling hot resin fumes. The bulk of the painting will be really quick because I decided to go full Bob Ross and add the main colors with a makeup sponge. Especially if you are batch painting, you can probably get this step done on a squad of 20 in under 2 hours. That's less time than it takes a Custodes player to explain why they are balanced. To make the transitions a bit smoother, I started by picking up some moisture with the sponge and then picked up paint from my palette. I'm working off of a brown base coat that I applied with a spray can, and I want to have some of the brown to shine through the main color, which in this case starts from webbing green, which is a nice desaturated olive green. You can see that I'm putting on layers of opaque color where the main highlights would go, and then I'm gradually fading out these layers into the brown. What I usually do is let the first layer dry before I go over it again with a second layer to make it opaque. Mainly because the sponge takes off a lot of paint from the mini again if the paint isn't dry yet. You can see that this goes really quick on exposed, larger areas, but I have to cut the sponge into smaller pieces for harder to reach areas. And every time I want to be more precise. For the first layer of highlights, I mixed webbing green with light drab and I sponged that on, assuming a Senator light source. And this builds up to a natural looking global light on the mini and defines the shapes nicely. And I made these highlights even more pronounced using a lighter mix of webbing green and light drab. For example, the right leg stepping forward would catch a lot of light, and of course the helmet, pauldrons and chest plate. For the edge highlights I used pure light drab, and I started with these obvious choices like any edge that is facing up and anything I wanted more pronounced like the visor part and the ridges on the leg guards. The chest area is a rather large surface and I wanted to find a way to make it look more interesting. So I pronounced that slot indent in the middle with an edge highlight all around it and then added an inverted edge highlight below the trim, which makes everything read as a lot brighter. I kept going with this, and honestly, edge highlights sometimes get a bad rap, but it feels like honest work and it's just so effective to define all of these Space Marine shapes. Like if the technique didn't exist, it would have to be invented for Space Marines. I did add some final volumetric highlights, like on the helmet, and I also painted a highlight on some of these cylindrical shapes, like the Power Fist. I liked how the olive green was progressing so far, but I wanted a little more saturation in some areas. So I grabbed algae green speed paint and thinned it down a lot. And then I applied a bunch of glazes, pushing the pigments away from the highlights and into the darker parts to avoid staining. This step is great because the speed paints are transparent but also very chromatic. So they do add a lot of vibrancy, and at the same time they darken the greens in the deeper areas where I needed more shading. Now this did tone down some of the edge highlights, and in hindsight I should have done this before I applied them, but for some reason I never think of this beforehand. Just some of these bad habits that are really hard to shake. But do as I say and not as I do, I guess. Last but not least, I did go over some of the shaded parts with the little ruddy fur, because the Hyrax brown base coat still shining through in the shadow areas did not produce the reddish brown result I had hoped for. I also did something similar on my Saturnine Salamanders, and while these are darker to begin with, I like how that element will draw them both together besides using slightly different base colors. For the metal trims, I used True Copper as a base color, and then right away added a gray wash to dull down some areas. I just grabbed a random medium gray from my table, and it's just to minimize some of the shine of the metallics. The idea is to create more contrast by putting dull areas on the metals next to shiny ones, because dull and reflective is a contrast too. And just like dark and bright, and it makes these parts more interesting to look at. Next I added burnt umber ink to most of the recesses to make them darker and the bronze tones a bit richer. And I followed that up with a wash of a dark turquoise, which adds a subtle patina effect. I finished up the metallics by thin layers of weapon bronze, and then finally specks of tainted gold to make some parts extra shiny again. I started the skin from a black base coat as I wanted to keep some black in the very recesses, and then I went over most parts with Tenebrous Grey, which is a very dark purple grey. To highlight this, I gradually added Ducat Blue to the Tenebrous Grey, and I started to define the facial features. I did add some thinned down slaughter red that I used for the scales on that shoulder you see here, to the lips, below the cheekbones and the eye sockets, which adds a bit more variety and vibrancy. The color starts to slightly shift between purple and magenta, and then as I add more highlights, also blue. In fact, going back to the highlights, I did continue to highlight the features until everything was starting to read as slightly blue. And then I switched to light field gray for some last specular highlights. There's a bit of green in there, and I'm not saying green is a warm color, but it is definitely warmer than blue, and that makes for an interesting result. I base coated the cables on the Disintegrator in yellow and then washed them in an orange speed paint called Nuclear Blast. And this provides some depth to the cables, but also divides the individual strains. I had to clean up some of the orange, and I did that by running my brush across the cables a couple of times using yellow, and then continued to detail the cables. Adding this industrial pattern of yellow and black stripes always makes any tech really archaic looking, which is a style I like a lot in the context of Horus Heresy. And after I had the stripes cleaned up, I dragged white over both the black and the yellow in one go to make the insulation material look smooth and glossy. I like to reuse paints as often as possible on minis, so I added washes of ruddy fur to the metals on the rifle for some depth, and then built the highlights back up with bright aluminium. I knew I wanted to do the center of the weapon, which looks like a coil in a glowing way, and that's why I kept the casing as black as possible, because OSL always looks better when it's applied to a dark base color. So I just dabbed on a bit of silver on the edges of the weapon to define it, and called it a day. But before I got into all the special effects I had planned on these guys, I just wanted to wrap up some detail. So I painted all the lenses in a very simple way, defining the shapes and highlights with pure white over black, like you can see here on the Cyclops style eye lens on the helmet, and then stacked a few layers of fluorescent red over each other. This runs a bit into the recesses too, which creates a subtle glow effect. And I like this more desaturated result. For some reason I find it more fitting for the 30K setting. I also quickly fixed one thing I wasn't entirely happy with, and that was the hue of the brass trims. The patina was a little too subtle for my taste, so I took a pure turquoise, I thinned it down and added it around the rivets and into other recesses. But again, I made sure it didn't just creep into all recesses, so there would still be enough of the reddish brown metal visible. I had an idea for real simple lava or fire bases, and it involved using some liquid pigment. I got these AK Wargame enamels a few years ago, but I never used them. Now, however, was their time to shine. Being enamel based, I had to use a solvent to thin them, so my workflow was to slap some of the paint on the simple base I built and then added thinner on top, which made the pigment creep into all these recesses. I repeated that a couple of times using Fire Breath Red, and you can see that I also let it creep into the crevices of the feet and leg armor. And while the pigment was still wet, I switched to Orange Blizzard and dabbed it into the red and let it spread out any way it wanted to. That resulted in a great variety of red and orange, which sold the effect even better. And then I dry brushed on Tenebrous Grey and eventually black to increase the contrast between the supposedly cooler outer and hotter inner areas of the ground. And the pigment creeping into the recesses of the feet and then drying there turned out a really awesome effect. You could argue this is pretty ridiculous because it looks like the feet turn glowing hot, but it also kind of looks like the heat from below is reflecting in the features of the armor. The bottom line is, it's a simple effect with a high impact and I like the result a lot. I had a very particular idea for the cloak that also involved letting liquid pigments run into the recesses. But first I had to define the individual scales. I used a mix of red and green, which gave me a color range from dark green to this interesting purple, and I tried to find a combination I liked. And ultimately going for a purple base right over black and then highlighting with a mix that leans more towards green. And then I added more and more aqua alchemy, painting on lines and other structure that would fit the sculpt, focusing the brighter paint on more exposed areas to build some light and shadow. So while I went up to almost pure aqua alchemy, I made sure to cover only the tips of the scales or the upper edges and so on. So the individual scales would still read as kind of dark, which would make the next step shine a lot more. I did all the Drakehide in the same way and then went back to the AK liquid pigments. And while I applied them, I made sure to go from the outside inwards, using gradually brighter pigments. So on the outside, I started with dark rust dust, which is a dark red brown, followed by light clay, which is a more straightforward brown, then medium earth, which is a yellow brown, and finally desert dust, which is a straight up bright beige. Now I tried this approach in a couple of ways, like on the shoulder guard with the scales I used medium earth straight over slaughter red, and then cleaned off whatever pigment spill onto the raised areas with thinner and a makeup sponge, so the pigment only stayed in the recesses. And after I established the gradient I just showed you on all the other Drakehide parts, I did the same cleanup steps on these, making sure the scales would be dark and contrasting against the bright and dusty looking area between them. Some snakeskin kinda looks like that, and that's where I got the idea from. And while you can do this with regular paint, the pigment offers a couple of advantages. Unlike acrylics, you can clean any spill of raised areas with a thinner and no frantic scraping or repainting necessary. And it looks really opaque with only one pass, which makes it faster to do. You would struggle to find a bright acrylic paint that would cover like this in under 3 passes. Also, the end result is really vibrant and intense. Wherever I feel like I lost a bit of that intensity, especially in the red browns, I glazed on some burnt sienna, like you can see on this cloak. And yeah, this takes a while, but it's not difficult at all, and I would say the impact it has is absolutely worth it. Also, it was fun to do, so that's another plus in my book. I did refine all the edges with a turquoise mix that I still had on the palette when doing the scales to frame the Drakehide parts, and I also added some dents and scratches to the darker regions of the leather. And to make them a little more interesting, I wanted some of the bright glow from below to be visible on the inside of these cloaks, so I gave anything that faced straight down 1 or 2 layers of slaughter red. You know, technically I would have to do this on any part of the mini that is close to the ground and that's somewhat reflective, but I just didn't want to turn this into an OSL fest, and I wanted to be done before 4th edition of Horus Heresy comes out. And just putting it on the dark inside of the cloaks kinda sells the effect on its own. Also, as you might have guessed, we would still have a lot of special effects coming up, and I simply didn't want a visual overload. And speaking of special effects, I painted all the coil structure of the Disintegrator in white, and then using white ink sprayed a halo effect around it on the adjacent parts of the rifle. I covered all of this in a layer of contrast paint frost hard and painted any edge that was facing the slide source with Ducat blue. I did the same thing on the arm that was close to the light source, spraying a white halo and covering it in frost hard, so the OSL would look more credible as it's spreading outwards, and then mix the wash from white oil paint and thinner. I let this mix run into the recesses where it is supposed to mark the hottest areas of the coil. And the last step was to darken the coils itself with a dark blue that is supposed to represent the cooler parts. I also dropped white oil paint into the recesses of the hammer, as well as the flamer and all other details I wanted to glow hot from within, like the power fist and some details on the furnace backpack. Then I cleaned up the spill and painted in white on the rest of the flames with regular acrylics. Then whenever it was easy to do without hitting anything I painted before, I airbrushed on fluorescent yellow and let it run into recesses with a brush in less accessible areas. Then I switched to orange fluo and airbrushed it onto the flames from the front and slightly up of the flames. You can dry brush these steps, but the best effect is achieved with an airbrush. And if you are looking for an affordable quality airbrush solution, check out the gallery airbrushes and compressors that I'm using. They have a massive sale going on, up to 40% off right now, and you can add an additional 10% if you use my affiliate link in the description. You can get the Mobius 3.0 that I'm using for half the original price right now, which is basically a steal. The airbrush isn't everything though. We also have to rely on brush skills sometimes, and as you can see, I used the brush to apply the orange where it was difficult to avoid the recesses due to overspray, and it generally being a very small area. On the rest of the weapons, I let the orange fluid run into the recesses with a brush and continued to build the gradient gradually, going darker by spraying on Slaughter Red. I had some red overspray on the backpacks, which sparked the idea for more OSL, so I put white on all the edges facing the flames and then went over that with orange fluo. I also put a few orange fluo dots in front of the small grid on the front view of the backpack, leaving a cast shadow by the individual bars. And this little glow and shadow interplay is probably my favorite part of the Mini now. On the tip of the flamer I had sprayed a halo with white, basically a reflection of the giant flame coming out of it. So I covered the top part that was further away with Slaughter Red and the very front facing the flame with pure orange fluo. And then eventually with yellow, as it is really close to that light source. I also brought back some brighter colors towards the hotter parts in the recesses with yellow while I was at it. And I dry brushed the hammer with the Tenebrous Gray. This works here because it's a very dark purple, and that makes it fit better than black because we still have a bit of color in it, and that makes the dark areas a lot more interesting. I also added some to the top of the flames and airbrushed black from the front of the flamethrower again to round out the effect. And then there was only a few details left to do. I sponged some extra dark green on as a highlight on the black cloak and used light field gray as a highlight on the edges, and also added some wear and tear with it. Then I used my usual approach with decals, softening them out with microsole and dabbing on a bit of chipping with my base color mix. And here's the result. I really think the Greytide bits, once they were sized to the correct ratio, really make all the difference here. They're propelling these generic Mark II suits from something everyone has to a uniquely themed force that looks like it just stomped out of the ruins of Istvan. It's still smoldering. And like I said a couple of times, I think especially the Drakehide bits add a lot of flavor. They evoke the ritual craftsmanship and mythic beast hunting traditions of Nocturne. These guys aren't just warriors, they're master artisans of annihilation. The additional weapon options and those chunky, characterful pauldrons tie everything together. These aren't your standard issue starters, these are the ones that Vulcan himself would have nodded at approvingly before handing them a flaming hammer and sending them towards the nearest traitor line. I like how the desaturated greens contrast against all the vibrant warm tones of the flames and the ground and all the other weapon effects. And the armor is calm, composed, stoic, and the weapons, the base and the special effects, the pure fury. In my opinion, that's the Salamanders right there. Still patient, and when the time comes, they burn the galaxy to ash. The simplicity of the bases especially, while still creating an effect that looks like $1 million, is something I'm really happy with. Don't forget to check out Greytide Studios' Annual Warden sale to grab your 20% discount using the links in the description and entering the code on screen before the 28th of August. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and remember, no need to be afraid, it's only paint.